Hello everyone, I'm Santiago, and today I'm gonna be testing PUBG or PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds on the GeForce GTX 1050 Ti. For FPS monitoring, this time I won't be using cam due to BattleEye, which is the anti-cheat software this game uses. So in the meantime, I'll be using MSI Afterburner instead. And if you enjoy the content and want to support the channel directly, there are Humble and Amazon affiliate links down in the description. So PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds or PUBG, I'll be doing 1080p, 900p, 720p and 1440p. To skip down those sections of the video, check the description below. So first I'll show you 1080p and 720p on the G4560. First of all, I show you a 60-ish FPS configuration. Then I crank up the settings as much as possible, trying to stay over 30 frames per second. And then I show you 720p on pretty much medium settings to just prove a point. So first of all, on 1080p to target 60-ish FPS, we have anti-aliasing on very low, post-processing on very low as well, shadows on medium, textures on high, effects on very low, foliage on low, and view distance on high. So far this was enough to be close to 60 frames per second. It dropped when I was being shot at or shooting someone in certain scenarios. Then when you're in a red zone, it drops below 60 frames per second very easily because there are many explosions around you. But yeah, overall it seems that the G4560 is limiting the GPU in this case, so it's kinda difficult to maintain a consistent 60 frames per second. Then I just crank up the settings quite a bit. I keep everything maxed out except in shadow textures and effects, which are on high instead of ultra, and that's enough to be over 30 frames per second just fine. Then I show you 720p on a mix between medium and low, and you will see that the GPU usage will be pretty much 50 to 70%, so the GPU is being limited by the CPU. Why am I showing you this? This is just to show you that the G4560 can hit 60 frames per second, but not that consistently. It can drop quite a bit, especially when there's someone shooting at you, a lot of people close to you in a town, or moving fast through the map with a car, for example. So yeah, after that I just swapped to the Ryzen 3 1200 with a 3.9 GHz overclock. What does this mean? Well, this CPU has 4 cores instead of the 2 cores of the G4560, so it's 2 cores and 4 threads versus 4 cores and 4 threads. And so far for what I played on Ryzen 3, it was more stable, yeah. It still dropped below 60 frames per second in certain scenarios, but it felt way more stable, so that's why I show you 900p and 720p here. Since on the G4560 it won't be that different compared to 1080p. As I told you a second ago, the G4560 is limiting the graphics card, so lowering the settings doesn't help that much. If you go below 1080p, it will be pretty much the same drops in the same places, just because the CPU is not good enough for all the stuff that's going on around you. Remember, there are like over 90 players, including yourself. So that's a lot to do. And well, on 1080p on the Ryzen, I used the same settings as on the G4560. I just saw a more stable frame rate. And then on 800p and 720p, I cranked up the settings compared to 1080p. For example, to get 60 frames per second on those resolutions is much easier. So I was able to use higher settings there. High textures across the whole video because it already uses like 4 GB of VRAM. So if you want to use ultra textures, you might want to have 6 GB of VRAM or more. Also shadows, I tend to keep them on high on 900p and higher, as well as effects, which I kept on medium and low sometimes when I target 60 frames per second. If you don't do that, when you're in a red zone and there are explosions and all that kind of stuff, the frame rate will tank a lot when you're just going around that red zone. And well, after those 60 frames per second configurations on those 2 resolutions I just mentioned, I crank up the settings as high as possible, trying to stay over 30 frames per second, like I did on 1080p. And well, finally at 1440p, I couldn't get 60 frames per second even at the lowest settings, so I just used a mix between medium, low and very low, something like that, trying to stay over 30 frames per second as much as possible at 1440p. But personally, I recommend playing at 900p targeting 60 frames per second with the config I selected, or 1080p with pretty much a mix between medium and very low to get the best control response plus the best consistency. So aiming is not that difficult and you have a competitive advantage on the game. So far I find quite hard to aim at below 40 frames per second in this game in particular. The frame times are quite inconsistent, but if you want 60 frames per second as consistent as possible, you need to have a faster CPU. If possible, a very high clocked quad core or something like that. I suspect that an i5 8400 should be good enough for that, but I don't have it, so I cannot test it. But yeah, so far the game is running much better than before, than the first time I tried it, like a year ago I think. So it's good to see that it's just running better and better with the updates coming out. And also keep in mind that since this is a multiplayer game, I won't be able to make perfect tests. You'll see the drops in the frame rate when moving fast through the map, so if you're driving a car or something, the CPU will limit the GPU more. So yeah, what I did was going into the town that it's in the middle of the map, pretty much, that has quite a bit of foliage, plus buildings, plus all that kind of stuff. And sometimes it becomes a red zone, so it was good for testing. But it won't be perfect testing, since on a multiplayer game it's impossible. There are too many variables. Players do different things each time, so I try to be as consistent as possible with the testing. I plan on testing this game more often, because you guys asked me to test it each time a new update releases. But next time I'll test it, it will be when it's fully released, which is next month. Next month we'll have a new map, plus you'll be able to climb and all that kind of stuff, the bolt mechanics, so it will be interesting. But yeah guys, that's pretty much it. I hope you keep enjoying the video, thanks for watching and see you next time.